Red is the magic color that's the most interested in doing damage quickly. As a result, it often receives effects that multiply or augment the amount of damage you can do. This kind of effect can result in massive amounts of damage being dealt in a single turn, so there are some really powerful cards that have this kind of effect. In this video, we'll look at cards that multiply or augment damage. In all, there were 59 cards that qualified, and in this video we'll look at the 10 that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I rank cards in these videos. I use a scoring system where a card is awarded with 2 points for a first tier top 8, like a Pro Tour, and 2 points for a second tier top 8, like a regional championship. Alright, let's take a look at the top 10 cards that augment damage. At number 10, I've got Gratuitous Violence. For 2 generic and 3 red mana, it's an enchantment that doubles the damage that creatures you control would deal to a permanent or player. Its one Pro Tour top 8 came at the Onslaught Block Pro Tour, where it was played in the sideboard of a Goblin deck. These decks had lots of goblins that could do damage in a hurry. Gratuitous Violence hasn't gained any points since 2003, so newer cards that augment damage are likely to push it off this list in the future. At number 9, it's Rem Corollas, Stalwart Slayer. For 1 generic, a red, and a white, it's a 2/3 with flying and haste. It prevents all damage that a spell would deal to you or your permanents, while also increasing by 1 the damage of your spells. Those abilities, combined with solid stats, make Rem a pretty powerful card, especially when going up against other red decks that are interested in doing damage with spells. Increasing the efficiency of your burn spells while shutting down your opponents is pretty sweet. It's never been a heavily played card in Standard, but it has seen play intermittently, including in Boros Aggro and 5-color Legends. The latter could leverage Rem's legendary super type for extra value. It's just about to rotate out of Standard though, and is yet to catch on in any other formats, so it may be done putting up top finishes entirely, in which case there's a good chance it gets bumped off the top 10 in the future. At number 8, it's Pyromancer's Swath. For 2 generic and a red, this enchantment makes instants and sorceries you control deal 2 extra damage to permanents and players. It also makes you discard your hand at the end of your turn. While this only augments instants and sorceries, red is kind of famous for being able to do tons of damage with those, so doing even more damage with them is seriously powerful. The Swath was played in Standard and Extended Storm decks between 2008 and 2009, and Storm was the perfect home for this kind of card. After all, having to discard your hand every turn is a pretty big downside, but if you plan on having one huge turn that ends the game, you don't really need to worry about it. Storm decks look to chain together a whole bunch of card draw and mana generation with cards like Manamorphose, and then cast a card with Storm to win the game. Storm gives you a copy of a card you cast for each spell that was cast before it in a turn. Grape Shot is one of the most common ways to win, and if you have the Swath in play, you suddenly don't need that high of a storm count to do lethal, since each Grape Shot copy now does a whopping 3 damage. The Swath hasn't had a top finish since 2009 though. At number 7, it's the Flame of Keld. For 1 generic and a red, it's an enchantment with the Saga subtype, and it's one of the original sagas, as it's from Dominaria, the set where they debuted. A saga enters the battlefield with a lore counter on it and gains another lore counter after your draw step each turn. When it gains a lore counter, you get the effect of the chapter with the same numerical value as the number of lore counters on the saga. In other words, you get chapter 1 right away, chapter 2 on the next turn, and chapter 3 on the turn after that in most cases. Then it gets sacrificed. In this case, chapter 1 makes you discard your hand, chapter 2 draws you 2 cards, and chapter 3 is what gets this card on the list, because it makes your red sources that would deal damage to a permanent or player that turn deal that much damage plus 2 instead. The Flame of Keld can be kind of tricky to play since that chapter 1 can be a downside, but if you're playing a super aggressive red deck, this card can do some serious work. That style of deck usually empties its hand quickly, so chapter 1 ends up being irrelevant, chapter 2 draws you some gas, and chapter 3 makes all your red creatures and burn spells do even more damage, so the Flame of Keld can actually close out games really effectively in the right deck. Unsurprisingly, the Flame of Keld has been featured in mono red decks that have put up top 8s in mono red aggro decks in both Standard and Modern. So far, it hasn't had a top finish in 2024, but it's good enough in the right deck to put up some points in Pioneer, or more points in Modern in the future. At number 6, it's Angrath's Marauders. For 5 generic and 2 red, this 4/4 creature doubles the damage any source you control would deal to a permanent or player. That's the broadest damage augmentation effect we've seen so far. As a result, the Marauders had to be pretty darn hard to cast and also have some seriously below rate stats, although it does augment the damage it does too, so it's effectively an 8/4 at least. But that high mana cost and bad stats don't really matter in the decks that the Marauder has been played in. This is because it gained all of its points alongside Wynota in Pioneer. If you've got Wynota in play and you attack with non-human creatures, for each one that's attacking, you look at the top 6 cards of your library and put a human card from among them onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, and it gains indestructible until end of turn. The Marauder was one of the most powerful hits off of the trigger because if you hit the Marauders with it, your board probably just became lethal out of nowhere between all the non-human attackers and the humans that were just put into play tapped and attacking. When you put it into play for free and it's already attacking and it's indestructible, all those downsides of the Marauder just go away. In 2022, Wynota got banned, and Angrass Marauder has yet to find another home in any format. At number 5, it's Dictate of the Twin Gods. For 3 generic and 2 red, this enchantment doubles the damage any source deals to any permanent or player. It also has Flash. So unlike the others we've seen so far, this one is symmetrical. In other words, you've got to worry about your opponent's stuff doing double damage too. However, Flash helps you break that symmetry since you can choose to do something like flash it in at the end of your opponent's turn, then you're the first player who gets a turn with this powerful damage multiplier. You can even wait to flash it in until your opponent has chosen not to block your creatures and do lethal. It gets all of its points in standard Boros aggro decks. At number 4, it's Insult to Injury. This is a split card with Aftermath, which means there's one side you can only cast from your hand and the Aftermath side, which you can only cast from the graveyard. The Insult side is the one that qualifies it for this list. For 2 generic and a red, it's a sorcery that makes it so damage can't be prevented this turn, and all of your sources that would deal damage that turn deal double that damage instead. The graveyard-only side, Injury, synergizes pretty nicely with this, since it's a sorcery that costs 2 generic and a red, and does 2 damage to target creature, and 2 damage to target player or planeswalker. So if you've got 6 mana around, you can cast both sides one after the other, and then Injury does 4 damage to both targets. In theory, you've got some creatures to attack with too, which can result in a huge amount of damage in a single turn, and just to be careful, your opponent can't do anything to prevent that damage either. It was played in Rakdos aggro decks while it was in Standard, and more recently it's been played in modern sideboards. Obviously it's useful against any deck looking to prevent you from doing damage, a common sideboard strategy against red decks, but most notably, it gets around the damage prevention part of the One Ring's protection, which is often really bad news for the player who plays the ring, especially when the damage is also doubled. Insult to Injury so far hasn't gained any points in 2024, but depending on the metagame, it's the kind of card that could show up back in Modern or Pioneer. At number 3, it's Gisela, Blade of Gold Knight. For 4 generic, a red, and 2 white, she's a 5/5 with flying and first strike. She doubles the amount of damage that is dealt to an opponent or a permanent they control, while having the damage that would be dealt to you. This is a pretty scary creature, because it means that all on her own, she can do 10 damage at a time, and taking her down in combat is virtually impossible between her size, first strike, and damage prevention. Like Angrass Marauders, she is super expensive, but anytime Gisela is being used, her mana cost isn't actually paid. She was reanimated while in Standard, and in Vintage, she used to be one of the creatures Oath of Druids decks like to put into play. Oath of Druids decks can get her into play as early as turn 2, and she was particularly good against opponents who were trying to go wide with small creatures, since her damage prevention made it very hard for them to hit for significant damage, while she could end the game in 2 swings. She's been outstripped by lots of recent powerful creatures though, and hasn't gained any points since 2018. At number 2, it's Obosh the Prey Piercer. For 3 generic and 2 black-red hybrid mana, it's a 3/5, and it makes your damage sources with odd mana values deal double damage to permanents or players. This counts itself, of course, so Obosh is effectively a 6/5. Importantly, Obosh also has Companion. This means that if you meet the deck building requirement, you have access to this card out of your sideboard during the game. For Obosh, your starting deck has to contain only lands and cards with odd mana values. If you do that, you can pay 3 generic at sorcery speed to put it into your hand from your sideboard during the game. Originally, the mechanic was even more busted, and you could simply cast the Companion from your sideboard. This meant you basically had 8 cards in every opening hand, which was pretty broken, and that's why the rule got changed. Anyway, obviously if you're meeting this requirement, Obosh actually doubles the damage all of your cards do, so when it comes down, your board usually gets a massive buff. Obosh was successful in Standard both before and after the companion mechanic got changed, with Temur aggro decks the most frequent home for the card. This deck didn't go out of its way to play Obosh as the companion, it just so happened that the best cards for the deck were at 1 and 3 mana, and the deck also had adventures, like Bone Crusher Giant, which got you around the downside of not having any 2-drops thanks to the adventure side, which costs 2 mana. It's also played in Pioneer Red Deck Wins, which is made up almost entirely of 1-drops, and it's also played in Red Blood Moon decks in Modern. Blood Moon locks mini decks out of the game, often actually giving you the time to put Obosh into your hand and in the game on the next turn. Obosh is still putting up top finishes in Modern right now, and it's likely to keep gaining points, but so is the card in front of it, which is Torbran, Thane of Redfell. For 1 generic and 3 red, it's a 2/4, and if a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent they control, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. Torbran counts himself, so he's effectively a 4/4. The game plan with Torbran is to curve out with red creatures, and by the time you get to Torbran, you often just have lethal. Torbran along with Embercleave really made red decks absurd in Standard, and they also comboed well together, as if you have a creature equipped with the Cleave, it does 2 extra damage on both hits from Double Strike. Torbran has continued to find success in Pioneer Red Deck Wins, and is likely to keep gaining points. It will probably be the #1 card on this list for the foreseeable future. So those are the top 10 damage, multiplier, and augmentation effects in Magic. Do you want to do tons of damage? If so, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the more than 750 other MTG Top 10s, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.